Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Louisville's own River City Drum Corps founder and director, Edward White.
Wow. First of all, I would like to say good morning. Good morning. I would like to say good morning to the soldiers who are on the front lines. Y'all are the soldiers that are on the front lines. And as I give you a short story, you go to a tea party, a cocktail party, and everybody is around the room talking about what they do and who they are. Oh, I'm a lawyer. I try some of the greatest cases that come, and I've even been to the Supreme Court. I am a surgeon, and I was the first one who happened to separate Siamese twins. I happen to be the personal secretary for Bill Clinton. And it just goes around the room and around the room. And then there's this quiet little lady sitting, and everyone is saying, and you know, you can feel it. Everyone's had their 15 minutes or 15 seconds of fame. And everyone, and she's sitting there and she can feel the eyes upon her, and she's saying, you know, I guess they want to know what I do. And guess what? Guess what she finally, after all of the prodding and all of the eyes and the ums, and you know how it is when everyone wants you to talk, but you really don't want to talk. And she says, oh, I'm a teacher. And one of the ladies says, that's nice. Is that what you do? And she looked at her and said, you know what? I made all of you all. I give to you the River City Drum Corps. I thank you for your time. Continue to do the work, and always remember that you are on the front lines And everybody in this room that walks have three things in common: a mother, a father, and a teacher. I thank you all. I present to you the drum line.
C2. Stick control. 3.
Please welcome to the stage Secretary Tom Zawacki, Secretary of the Education and Workforce Development Cabinet.
Let's give another big thanks to the River City Drum Corps for their rousing performance. Welcome everybody to day 2 of the Ready Kids Conference. I think we're energized and ready to go. As the announcer mentioned, my name is Tom Zawacki. I'm the Secretary of Education and Workforce Development here in the state of Kentucky, and I'm a relatively new face to most of you. I've been a Kentucky state employee for only a few years, and I'm approaching my 1-year anniversary, actually, of being Secretary of this cabinet. I retired from Toyota, a little company over in Georgetown, in June of 2009 as the General Manager of Administration. And if you know anything about making cars at Toyota, you know that they are extremely process-oriented. And each process is clearly, carefully designed, would have a very specific outcome with a very high level of built-in quality. And once that's achieved, the process owner transfers that to the next process. And we call that next process is my customer. And it's a very logical and quality-oriented philosophy. And I find what we're trying to do in the Education and Workforce Development Cabinet is much the same way that Toyota does. Next process is my customer. We must send the highest possible quality to the next process. We have to make sure of the readiness of our students to meet the needs of the next process. An effective early childhood development should result in children who are kindergarten ready. And if kindergarten is successful, it should result in primary school ready and middle school ready. And you get the point that I'm trying to make. That ultimately the students, the children, become college ready or ultimately work ready. So I think as Education and Workforce Development Secretary, that early childhood development is a workforce development tool at its most practical sense. All of our cabinet employees and I have truly engaged from cradle to career and beyond. Education and workforce development must be joined at the hip. And if they are joined, effective economic development should be the product. It should be the result. And of course, all of you you get it, or you wouldn't be here. This audience is made up of true believers in the importance of building the right foundation in early childhood. Do they have my grandchildren up here yet? Oh, great. I should have introduced them earlier, actually. I couldn't bring my grandchildren. Two of them are in Washington, D.C., and two of them are at STEM camp here in Louisville. But at least Terry allowed me to bring my wonderful grandchildren, my newest one, David, the baby David, on the upper left-hand corner there. So if you wondered who those children were, they are my grandchildren. Anyway, as a proud grandfather of four, I have a renewed appreciation for the amazing rate of growth and development in a child's early years. I guess if I had known this when I was the father of two daughters, it would have scared me to death. But as a grandfather and as a businessman and now as a policymaker, I can understand the next process is my customer applications that relate to education and workforce development. It just makes sense. Early care and education isn't just about doing the right thing for kids. It's really about giving the kids the foundation they need to be successful at whatever stage of life that they're in. We know that kids who are ready to thrive in kindergarten are more likely to read at grade level, and those that are able to read to learn are more able to graduate from high school and go on to college or career and become positive contributors to society. You know, employers, I talk with employers every day that are looking to work with the Economic Development Cabinet in bringing new plants, new businesses here to Kentucky. And for those that already have plants here, to keep them here and provide them the resources they need to be successful here in Kentucky. And when you think of all the things that businesses are looking for when they come here or when they are here already, you think of things like utility costs, low utility costs, roads, highways, taxes. But I'll tell you this, the number one thing that employers look for on their list is the quality of the workforce. And it all begins in early childhood. So on behalf of my grandkids, Kate and Laurel and Noah and David and all of the children whose futures you all impact, on behalf of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, thank you so much for all that you do to give our kids the best possible start in life and in career. Please enjoy today's sessions. Thank you very much.
Please welcome back to the stage Terry Tolan, Executive Director of the Governor's Office of Early Childhood.
Good morning. Ooh, it's bright up here. I see you out there, but thanks so much for joining us again this morning. How about yesterday? Did you have a good day yesterday? All right. Good. Well, we're just beginning, I think. We are looking forward to a number of breakout sessions today that will begin following this session, and I hope you've picked your favorites and plan to join us this morning. You know, so many people have donated their talent to this conference, and they have really used their time to bring you high-quality content and to share, in many cases, the lessons they have learned along the way in helping children to develop optimally. So we hope that you'll take advantage of that in the sessions today. We have a couple of really special things planned for you. I hope you're planning to join us tonight at the Science Center. How many of you have been to our Kentucky Science Center down the street? All right. Well, even if you're a veteran of the Science Center, and I know when my grandchildren come to visit, I like to take them to the Science Center, you may not have been there since they've mounted their experimental, Felicia, where are you? You probably have something other than experimental you'd call it, but exhibit for preschool-age children, but they have been testing exhibits for preschoolers that really encourage science as play, and they're in their second iteration of it now and have raised enough capital to devote the entire first floor of the Science Center to early childhood. and to activities that encourage science at play for preschool-age children. So this is a great opportunity for you to see it. They're opening the Science Center just for us tonight. Some of you may have signed up for classes. There are a small number of classes that are available that are science-focused. We also have a guest chef who will be joining us tonight, teaching you how to do healthy, delicious food for children that appeals to children. Hopefully it appeals to us too. But they have lots of fun activities planned for you in addition to the classes. If you'd like to have 2 more credit hours out of this week's conference, don't hesitate to sign up for classes. There is still room available. And Felicia has been in the Professional Development Central booth and will be happy to sign you up for tonight's session. And I understand at 7:30 tonight there are going to be door prizes at the Science Center. So the Science Center is open from 5 to 10. Classes are 6:30 to 8:30. Door prizes at 7:30. So make sure you make that part of your plan for the evening. I know 4th Street Live is probably calling you to come and enjoy the good food and entertainment in Louisville, but make sure that you have a stop at the Science Center on your way. The Science Center is an easy walk from here. It's just a couple of blocks. But if you prefer to ride, I understand it's going to be pretty warm this afternoon. The downtown trolley is here to serve you for free, runs from the corner just straight up on Main Street, and will drop you off right in front of the Science Center, and they'll continue to run throughout the evening at about 10 to 15-minute intervals. So feel free to take the trolley and or enjoy a stroll down Main Street and enjoy Louisville's iron front buildings and beautiful waterfront on the way. So we hope to see you at the Science Center tonight. We also hope you're going to plan to stay through lunch tomorrow. We know that sometimes the lure of home draws you out of here earlier than the end of the conference, but we do have a really exciting program planned in our closing plenary session tomorrow at noon. And I know we don't do this very often with conferences for early childhood educators, but we're actually going to feed you tomorrow, so you get lunch with us tomorrow. Want to do a special thank you to our all-star sponsors today. You met one of them yesterday, Leisha Lyman, representing United Way of Greater Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky, who was part of our celebration of the Born Learning Academies. Our other sponsor this morning was to be Joe Tolan, who's CEO of Metro United Way here in Louisville. You might have guessed there's kind of some similarity between the names. That is my better half. Unfortunately, he was not able to join us this morning, and I have brought some remarks from him to share with you. And there are a number of members of his staff here that we'll be happy to recognize. Joe's sorry that he wasn't able to be here this morning. He did ask me to talk to you a little bit about Metro United Way. Some of you may know I had a 25-year United Way career myself before being lured to the governor's office of early childhood. So I think I can say that I'm committed to their mission and their partnership in the work that we do as well. Joe asked me to share with you that Metro United Way is very proud to be an all-star sponsor of this conference because they really understand the importance of early care and education for not only for our children, but for our communities and for our future, Secretary, as you said. All of us know that a quality education leads to better income and a healthier life, and that's why Metro United Way is focused on helping children arrive at kindergarten ready to learn and then graduate from high school on time and prepared to go to college. It's quite simply the best way to change the odds for success for our children, especially those ensnared in the cycle of poverty. And we need to change the odds for these children because the price they pay and the price we pay for their future, for their failure, is way too great. Joe is especially proud of the fact that Metro United Way staff are leading several sessions here at the conference this week. You may have met yesterday afternoon in the 3:30 session. Melody Murphy was presenter in a session on social media and e-communication for Community Early Childhood Councils. Judy Schroeder and Kimberly Breckner are introducing their Ages and Stages work that they're doing in neighborhood-based settings to help parents assess the developmental progress of their child and find help if their child is lagging. And Corey Gdansky is talking about the Excellence Academy Early Learning project that they're doing this morning. And if those Metro United Way staff are in the audience, if you would please stand up, we appreciate hearing from you. Nope. One lone soul back there. I hope you also visited their booth out in the lobby and will learn more about what they're doing to create excellence in early childhood programs and to help teachers excel and programs excel so that children excel. And United Way is founded on the belief that a community of connected people, all of the people in the community, and all of us as members of the community working together can produce amazing changes in communities. It's the heart of what Metro United Way represents. Together we can change the odds for children. Joe says, you're a vital part of the solution. That's why they're investing in high quality early care and education, and you work at it every day. Joe would like to salute you for your dedication and passion, and thanks for what you do every day. So thanks to Metro United Way and to United Way of Greater Cincinnati for their financial support of this conference. We appreciate them. All right. One of the things that we're going to do this morning is to really celebrate that high-quality program. We all know that children who are in high-quality programs are more likely to thrive and to make the kind of progress that they need. And Senator Wilson, I see you. Thank you for joining us this morning. And we're going to honor some special centers, but one of the foundations of the work that we're doing, and if you were in our Race to the Top session yesterday afternoon, or if you plan to join us in any of the breakout rounds, because there is one of those repeating in every round, one of the things that you would hear the presenters say, no matter whether it is a member of our Governor's Office of Early Childhood staff or whether it is a member of our Early Childhood Advisory Council volunteer, but that one of the underlying premises of the proposal that we did in the Race to the Top competition was that children benefit from high quality, they need to be in high quality programs, and that, that we should aspire to have high quality no matter where programs are delivered. So in our past, we've kind of had the divide, I think, between public school-based programs and private sector programs. And we thought, you know, these are the standards that have to be adhered to for public programs, and then there's this different set of standards. Well, early on, being naive, not being an early childhood person initially, I thought, gosh, you know, if we know what quality is, if we know what works to help produce results for kids, why should it matter where that program's delivered? Shouldn't quality be quality, whether it's delivered in a school building or a community center or a church? All right. And if we know what quality looks like and it's the same everywhere, the same high bar, then why do we have different words that we talk about quality with, depending on whether it's delivered by a school or by a community center? And so one of our premises, well, there's kind of a flow, I think. We believe that if parents really understand what quality looks like in a program, that they'll make better choices about where their child gets that exposure to early care and education. And if parents make better choices, then we believe that they'll put them in high-quality programs, and kids will benefit from that, regardless of income. And so our plan is to recognize quality where it is and to recognize it in a way that's common to all programs so that every parent can make a good choice for their child based on our definition, our shared definition, not my definition of quality and what it means for kids. So one of the things we want to do this morning is to recognize quality, and we have some very special guests here to do that with us. I'm going to ask Elizabeth Whitehouse on our staff, the Deputy Executive Director, to come up and introduce our guests and welcome them to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. As you can see, I'm really working on my investment with early childhood, so I'm really privileged to introduce our next folks. We have Senator Mike Wilson here with us. He chairs the Senate Education Committee, and over the legislative sessions, I have the privilege of working with him and learning from him. And it's been a great opportunity because he doesn't just care about education, he cares about every section of education in early childhood, and he put a lot on the line for early childhood and to show that commitment. And he's here to present the award for STARS for folks that had received 4 stars in 2014. Senator Wilson, if you could come up, we love to have you here and really appreciate you coming by.
Thanks, Elizabeth. It is really fun to work with Elizabeth. She is one of these people that every time you see her, you can't help but smile because she always has a smile. And so, and she laughs a lot. So she's a fun person to have in the office, and it's a joy to work with her. So today I get the honor to present this award. The STARS program provides parents the information needed to make the best decisions on early care and education for their families. And this system of transparency and accountability highlights the private and public care and education programs that are helping children grow, learn, and succeed. STARS for Kids Now, 4-star programs. STARS is Kentucky's voluntary quality rating system for licensed Type 1, licensed Type 2, and certified family child care homes. Ratings are from 1 to 4 stars. And a program's participation in STARS for Kids Now indicates a commitment to quality above the minimum standards required by the Division for Regulated Child Care. STARS for Kids Now is part of the Kids Now initiative. What does it mean to have a 4-star rating? 4-star centers and family child care homes have met the requirements for levels 1, 2, and 3. They have lower staff to child ratios. They have achieved the highest scores in the Early Childhood Environmental Rating Scale, and they carry a national accreditation, and they have a highly qualified staff. The current 25 4-star license programs are shown on the screen, I would assume. Are we showing those on the screen? Well, hopefully we can get that up there. Today we would like to recognize the new 4-star program, Cherish the Child Center in Lexington. Jean Maynard, Executive Director, will be accepting the award. Jean? Congratulations to all of our highest quality programs, and thanks for being champions for doing what's best for kids. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Wilson, and thank you for being such a champion for education. It's our pleasure to work with our members of the General Assembly to assure that every child has the start that they need. Clearly, I'm not Derrick Graham. Representative Graham is tied up in traffic somewhere between here and Frankfurt. So we'll carry on his behalf. If he comes in, I'll call him up here on the stage with me. I do just want to say one thing about Cherish the Child and about Jean. When I called Jean and told her we were going to be recognizing her 4-star child care program this morning, I said, we're doing a celebration of 4-star child care and classrooms of excellence. And she said, I need to learn more about this classrooms of excellence, because if that's a higher bar than 4 stars, then I need to get to work. So we explained to her that classrooms of excellence were a program to honor preschool programs in the school system, but that we were working on a new star rating system, and they were soon going to be 5 stars, and she could aspire to that. So that's the kind of spirit and commitment to quality that we love to see. I'd like to recognize now our Classrooms of Excellence programs. The Kentucky Preschool Classrooms of Excellence is the highest honor bestowed upon lead teachers, and it is specific to a classroom of state-funded preschool programs. This designation means that those teachers have met the highest standards in their classrooms. They're models of exemplary practice, and as leaders in their district in the field of early childhood education, the Department of Education and others refer to these classrooms as sites to visit for folks who want to observe best practices. And Representative Graham, I'm stepping on your remarks right now, so if you will put you on the spot and bring you right up. Senator Derrick Graham, the chair of the House Education Committee, has now joined us. Thank you. I know you must have had a hectic morning if you were having a hard time getting here.
Very much so.
I was just explaining what Classrooms of Excellence are, so I'll turn it to you to recognize the 31 Classrooms of Excellence programs.
All right.
Thank you.
I apologize. We got to here in Jefferson County, came over the county line, got to an area down there by Jewish Hospital, and then, excuse me for the expression, all hell broke loose. So anyway, I have a brother who lives here. He's told me about the traffic in the morning, but I thought that with the school district being out, that it wouldn't be that big of a problem, but it certainly was. And if I didn't have Dr. Elaine Ferris with me on this journey, I think I'd had a nervous breakdown. As was being stated, it's a pleasure and an honor for me to recognize the 3 most important recipients of this Classroom Excellence Award for teachers in the Kentucky preschool program. These 3 teachers, Jennifer Arnold, Lori Allen, and Emily Wilcoxon, have worked diligently to meet the highest standards in pursuing this honor. They are all qualified teachers in an accredited program who have achieved the highest scores on the Early Childhood Environmental Rating Scale and on the Early Language and Literacy Classroom Observation Tool. Ms. Arnold, Ms. Allen, and Ms. Wilcoxon have also successfully completed the Kentucky Quality Self-Study for Early Childhood Programs and involved their families and communities in this process. It is with great pleasure that I present these certificates to Ms. Carlene Sheeran, the preschool coordinator of Hardin County, who is representing these teachers today. Let me say this to all of you who work in early childhood development. You know, I come from the education field, and I want you to know that it is your jobs, that you're serving in those classrooms, building upon the confidence of those young minds, that you are the key to the success of our children as they proceed across the education curriculum. So you are the front line, and I take this opportunity to thank you and all of you who are here who serve in early childhood development. Thank you for the service and the work that you provide to the kids all across our great Commonwealth. And with your support and with your help, our education system can move forward, which will allow Kentucky to be that shining light on that hill, to show the exemplary of what early childhood development is and has been to the development of the young minds of those students who are in your classrooms all across this Commonwealth. So we salute you, we salute all of you, and we thank you for the service that you have provided to the children of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. God bless you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so glad you made it.
Yeah, thank you. Here are those
All
certificates.
3 of those are mine,
Yes.
and I am the proud mom of
Thank
all
you,
of them.
thank you,
So,
thank you, thank you, thank you so much. Thank you all so much.
Please welcome to the stage Dr. Ruth Ann Shepard, Division Director of Maternal and Child Health, Department of Public Health in the Cabinet for Health and Family Services.
Good morning. So the time is now. Do you believe that? If I had to guess, I'd say the time is here. Look at this. We have over 1,000 people in this room dedicated to early childhood. So the time is here. So the question is, are you ready? Yes. Are you ready? Well, that's good because this is the Ready Kids Conference. And the conference is all about getting you ready to serve kids and families. Excuse me. So, now the video says Kentucky is dedicated to our families and children, but what that really means is you are dedicated. And if you weren't dedicated, you wouldn't be here. You don't do this because you make $1 million serving kids, right? But you're here because you want to make a difference. And so I want you all to think back to your early elementary school or a little bit before that, as early as you can remember. And can you remember a babysitter, your kindergarten teacher, somebody at church, maybe your Sunday school teacher, who said something to you that encouraged you, and you still remember that? How many of you have somebody like that in your life? Lots of people. Almost everybody. So think of how just a little thing like that can stick with you for the rest of your life. You do make a difference. And you make a difference not just in a feel-good way, but in a way that sticks with kids for the rest of their lives. And we now have a lot of science that really backs up how important that is. And that's what we're going to go over this morning. So we want to talk about the science behind early childhood and why that makes a difference, and why it's so important what you do in interacting with children and families. So we're going to start with the life course, health development, and think of health not as physical health, but as health and well-being. And we know that the course of our health development over our lifespan follows a trajectory, and it's a balance of risk factors and protective factors. So you'll notice a couple of things about this is that it starts before birth. And you all know the importance of a healthy pregnancy and how that can really impact the birth outcomes even before birth. So we follow this balance of risk factors and protective factors throughout our lives. And there are a couple things about this model. One is that there are critical periods of development during which an insult can have a long-lasting, permanent effect on your body's structure and function. And so we want to talk particularly about the impact of the brain development in the first 3 years. And you all know a lot of this science, but there's a lot of new science with it too. So we all know that the brain is not mature at birth. As a neonatologist, I took care of a lot of premature babies, and I would have families ask me if the lungs were mature. I never had a family ask me if the brain was mature. But you know what? The brain is the last organ system to develop. And brains are not mature at birth, which makes them particularly vulnerable to things that happen at birth and in the first couple of years after birth. The other thing that we know is that the brain is actually changed by experience. We used to think that that was very passive and that we were just born, you're born with the cards that you're dealt and you just learn to play them. Well, that's not true. Actually, what we're born with changes by our experiences. And the most important experiences are the hardwiring of the brain for social emotional function. And that happens in the first 2 years of life, that we lay down those brain pathways and hardwire the brain in the first 2 years of life for social emotional function. And that's about relationships with people. And the other thing that we know really well now is that adversity impacts brain development. And so the brain development that happens is not just the growth of the brain. It doesn't just get bigger, but it gets more complex in those first few years of life, particularly the first 2 years of life. And so the synapses, which is the connections of the brain and the way the axons and the dendrites reach out to each other and connect at the synapses, there are over 700 billion synapses per second being formed in the brain as it developed in those first 2 years of life. So it's an intentional overgrowth. We don't need all those synapses. And the way we decide which ones get hardwired in the brain is the ones that are used get wired in. The ones that are not used get pruned away. And so we have this repetitive cycling that actually creates the hardwiring of our brain in those first 2 years of life. And it starts with social emotional development. Now you can see here that there are very critical circuits that develop in those first 2 years, and especially in the first 5 years of life. Vision, hearing, language, cognitive function, thinking, social emotional development, All those happen in the first 5 years, and after that, your chances to improve those pathways decreases. So this was a slide, many of you have seen this before, this was a slide that really brought home the fact that the brain structure changes with experience. And on the right, you see the brain of a child who was abused and neglected from a Romanian orphanage, where the babies just laid there and looked at the ceiling. They didn't cry. They sometimes didn't get fed. Nobody rocked them, nobody held them, nobody talked to them. And for years, they laid there like that. And you can see their brains didn't develop. And on the left is the brain of a normal child, and the color indicates activity. So this was the slide that really taught everybody that you really do change the structure of the brain when you don't have a stimulating environment for kids to develop the hardwiring into their brain. And so these kids from the Romanian orphanage were part of an experiment, and they had actually got the Romanian government to allow some of those children to be adopted out into families who would nurture them and protect them. And the babies who were adopted out before age 2 ended up with fairly normal development. And the babies that were adopted out after that still had some developmental problems. And so we know that that first 2 years is the most critical period for the hardwiring of the brain. It happens during those first 2 years from birth to age 2, where the majority of that hardwiring is solidified in the brain for social emotional development. And it happens from this back and forth with mom and baby. And you see this, you do this all the time. Even if you see a kid in the grocery store, if it's a baby, the baby will smile at you and you'll smile back, right? And you'll coo and goo and try to get them to make sounds back at you. It's a natural part. That back and forth interaction is what hardwires the brain and solidifies those pathways in the brain. So it comes from a relationship and a nurturing relationship. And that's what hardwires our pathways for social emotional development. And it's those pathways that are then built on for our later cognitive function and executive function and our sense of self-identity. And so if those pathways don't get laid down well in the first 2 years of life, it's much, much harder to do those other things. So literally, they call it serve and return. And you can picture this not only in tennis, but just imagine holding a baby. And you can see yourself going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So the things that babies need, number one is a relationship. The baby needs a caring, responsive relationship that sets the framework and starts that back and forth interaction that hardwires the brain for social emotional functioning. Responsiveness, the child needs responsiveness in a caregiver because that's what helps the baby learn self-confidence and self-control. Routines are very, very important for very young children. And most of you are professionals, I don't have to tell you this, but routines make the child function better because if a child can learn what to expect, then the child can delay gratification or can know what's coming next. So for instance, if a child is hungry, but they know they always eat at noontime, then they can wait in most cases. But if they don't know when their next meal is coming, it just produces more anxiety in them and they don't know. It's very hard for them to not just be impulsive, so they don't learn self-control. And that repetition, again, laying down the brain pathways, very, very important for young children. And that's how we build resilience. It's the ability to think through problems and to plan things. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So as an adult, what are the social emotional skills that we look for? So there are a lot of them here, and you'll see these coming up more and more because now, as people learn what makes kids successful in school and in life, they talk more about the social emotional skills than they do about IQ. And the good news about that is we can teach social emotional skills, we can nurture social emotional skills, and that's what makes our kids successful. So we are not born with those social emotional skills. We are born with the capacity to build them, but we have to have the right conditions, the right environment, the right experiences to build those social emotional. And it starts with secure attachment. That very early parent-infant bonding, caregiver-infant bonding is what really starts us down the pathway of that secure social emotional functioning that allows us to build those other social emotional skills. So this is the way it normally works. You start with that parent-child bonding, talking back and forth. The baby's trying to get a response from you, you're trying to get a response from the baby. And that turns into, when the baby's older, you know, the parent will show the baby an object and name it, and you play the naming game. And then you start reading books to your child, hopefully very, very early. And then the child learns to read books for themselves. And then the child learns to write and express their feelings. All of that is a normal sequence that happens, and it starts back from the social emotional bonds. On the other hand, you saw on the slides that we have at least a quarter of our kids who live in poverty in Kentucky. And if you look at less than 200% of the federal poverty level, it's probably half. And that challenges the ability of families to work through this attachment piece, because it takes literally a superhuman effort just to do normal things when you live in poverty, if you're homeless, if you don't know where your next paycheck is coming from, if you don't know if you can pay your bills, if you don't know how you can feed your kids. That's stressful. And to put all that aside and bond properly with your child is really, really difficult. And so our families that live in poverty have additional challenges that we need to learn ways to help them with. They're not bad families. They are just challenged a lot more than you and I are. So here's what it's like, and this is from Ruby Payne's work on Bridges Out of Poverty. If people live in a chaotic family where they don't necessarily know where their next meals come from, they may not have a roof over their heads, it's just chaos, and there's no predictability to their everyday routines. So if there's no predictability, then you don't learn to identify what's cause and effect. And if you can't identify that there's a cause and effect, you don't identify consequences. And so many of our kids that grow up in that kind of environment, when they get to be teenagers, they have impulsivity and they don't see any reason to control their impulses because they don't know what's coming next. They don't know how to plan. And they frequently would get involved with the juvenile justice system. But it's not because they're bad kids, it's because that's the environment they've grown up in and that's how they've learned to adapt. So the other things that we see is this all starts very, very early. This is a score of language in homes. They actually went and counted the words that were used in these families' homes. And you can see that in a professional home, kids get exposed to a lot more words. And in working class, it's intermediate. And in low-income families, it's very low. But it starts before age 3. So remember that many of you work in this area where we're seeing from babies to age 5 before they get to school. And so the disparities in what they learn and what they know in their social emotional function actually has already started. So it gives us more opportunity to intervene. So this is from Dr. Shunkoff, who's the director of the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. He said, people who are worried about high school graduation rates, like Mr. Zawacki who talked to you earlier, should really worry about what their language development is like before age 3. And that's something we all get the opportunity to work on. So the problem is, if we wait till later, the brain circuits are not as malleable over time. It's much harder to do an intervention because the brain circuits are not forming and not developing as much after age 3, especially after age 5, although there is some change in brain wiring. And for those of you who work with adolescents, you'll know that, we talk about the immature adolescent brain. I don't know if you can tell that, but that last curve over there is the prefrontal cortex, and that's the decision making. And that continues to mature until 17 or 18, but all those other curves fall in birth to 5. An amazing opportunity we have to work with kids and families and create positive environments for kids in that birth to 5 that will really protect their brain development. So back to the life course perspective. The other thing to know about these arrows is they are accumulating over time. It's not, each arrow doesn't represent a one-time impact. They accumulate over time. And those arrows are from things in the child's environment and experiences. And so it's not just about the child. It's not just about the family. It's about the family's friends and church members and the community and the services in the community and public policy. All those things impact what happens with those arrows and whether they're up or down. And so we know a lot of the arrows that drag people down and provide worse outcomes. Nutrition, particularly key for young children. Stress, abuse, domestic violence, drugs, tobacco, alcohol, the list goes on and on and on of things in the environment, experiences for families that tend to pull us down. So the largest study that demonstrated this was called the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And it was actually done by the Kaiser Health Plan. Dr. Folletti is an internist in the Kaiser Health Plan. And the CDC, Bob Anda is a epidemiologist at the CDC. And what they found was that those early experiences that drag us down for our kids, birth to 5, have an impact that lasts into their adult life. So here's what happened. Dr. Folletti works at Kaiser. Now, I don't know if you know Kaiser Health Plan, but the people who are enrolled there basically are working. They have insurance, they have coverage, they go to work, they come to their jobs, and they go get their health physicals every year. And they have this huge database where they collect all that information. So in this study, they took 1,700 people, and when they came for their annual physical, you know how when you go to the doctor's office, you fill out about 6 pages of your history? Well, they did all that, and then they had all their records from any hospitalization or anything they'd ever had. And after they'd come for their annual physical, they sent them back a form, and they said, will you fill out this survey? And will you tell us, when you were a child before the age of 18, did you experience any of these things? And they looked at physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, substance abuse in the home, mental illness in the parent, a loss of a parent due to separation or divorce, or having a family member in jail. Now, they did not expect to get a big return on this, but they were interested in how childhood experiences impact adult health. Now, when they got the results back, they were shocked because a lot of people had had adverse childhood experiences. Almost 30% had suffered physical abuse as a child. Substance abuse, at least 1 in 4. I mean, this was huge, and there were so many of these that they ended up giving each category of those questions a score of 1, and they added them up. And as it turns out, 2/3 of the people that they surveyed, 2/3 of the people they surveyed had at least 1 adverse childhood experience. And 40% had 2 or more adverse childhood experiences. And that means in this room, probably more than half of you have had at least 1 adverse childhood experience. So what they did was they went back to try to link these to people's health as an adult. Now, if you think those numbers seem high, this was a study done by the Defending Childhood Initiative from Juvenile Justice. And look how similar the numbers are. They said that 60% of American children were exposed to violence. Totally different methodology, but they came up with the same number. And almost 40% were victims of 2 or more violent acts. Almost exactly the same number. This is a lot more prevalent than we ever dreamed. And it's affecting people's lives and their health. So all these things have been connected from adverse childhood experiences to adult disease. We're just going to talk about a few, but I want you to actually see the graphs here. Let's talk about health risk behaviors. In public health, we talk a lot about teen pregnancy. Big topic in a lot of communities, and we worry about teen pregnancy. But when they looked at teen pregnancy related to the adverse childhood experiences, if you had 0 to 1 adverse childhood experiences, there wasn't a very high risk of teen pregnancy. But as you go up, every time you went up in the number of adverse childhood experiences, you had a higher risk of teen pregnancy. And look at that, by the time you get to 7 or 8 adverse childhood experiences, almost half of those girls end up with teen pregnancy from the adverse childhood experiences. Smoking, another thing we work on in public health. For those kids who smoke before age 18, these are adults actually, the adults said if they had 0 to 1 adverse childhood experiences, the chances of them smoking before age 14 was pretty low. But the higher number of adverse childhood experiences, the more likely it was that people were smoking before age 14. Alcoholism. You know, we talk a lot about how this is intergenerational stuff and kids repeat what they learned from their parents. But maybe there's more to this than that, because these are, again, adverse childhood experiences, and the green there are the ones where the parent was an alcoholic. And you can see still that step-by-step correlation with low adverse childhood experiences, low risk of alcoholism. But the purple lines there are kids who had parents who were not alcoholics, but these kids had adverse childhood experiences. So for every increased adverse childhood experience, you got an increased likelihood that as an adult, that child would become an alcoholic. And that didn't matter what generation they were born in. The people they surveyed were an average age of 55. Sounds old to a lot of you, I know. But they went back and they looked at the different, when they were born, and it didn't matter what decade they were born in, you saw that very same correlation. So here's another one of our big public health problems, illicit drugs. And again, for this, they're surveying adults, and if they had 0 to 1 adverse childhood experiences, they had very little risk of becoming drug users when they were adults. But the more adverse childhood experiences they had, the more likely they were to be using drugs as an adult. And it's particularly true for IV drug use. And this one is scary because you can see how sharply that rises with 3 or 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. So for females who have had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, that accounts for 78% of the IV drug use. And for males, if they had 6 or more adverse childhood experiences, their risk of doing IV drug use was 4,500 times the risk of somebody with no adverse childhood experiences. So if we're trying to stop this epidemic of drug use in our country and in our state, one of the things that we're going to need to think about is how do we heal these adverse childhood experiences? So what Dr. Folletti and the CDC now say is we've been looking at this wrong. We've talked about all these behaviors as just being poor choices. You ever heard that? You're smoking, it's bad for you, why don't you just stop? You know, teen pregnancy, those teenagers, their prefrontal cortex is not mature yet, they're making bad choices. Well, you know, maybe it's a lot more than that. Maybe there's something that happened to them, and that's their coping strategy. That's what makes them able to cope. So what we see as their problem, they see as their solution to a prior problem. And if we just try to take that away from them and don't replace it with anything and don't offer them any healing, then we're not going to make the problem go away. Look at mental health problems here. Let's talk about depression. Particularly in women, the more adverse childhood experiences, the more likely you are to have chronic depression as an adult. And in women, you'll see with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, over half have chronic depression as an adult from the adverse childhood experiences. Ever attempting suicide? This goes up exponentially. There is a 30-fold increase in suicide attempts from people with no adverse childhood experiences to people with 7 adverse childhood experiences. A 30-fold increase. And we also see that they've broken it down just for teen suicide. You see the same pattern. And what about hallucinations? You know, I was a pediatrician for a while, and I guess still am. But when a parent would come to me and say, my teenager's having hallucinations, obviously the first thing I think of is drugs and alcohol, right? Certain drugs especially. So this is broken up by the light bars are those who did not have drugs or alcohol, and the ones that do use drugs and alcohol. And you can see this same pattern. If they had no adverse childhood experiences, the risk of hallucinations is pretty low. And as you have more adverse childhood experiences, you have more risk of having hallucinations as an adult. So what the thinking is now is that those hallucinations may not be a bad sign. They may be the way the brain is trying to adjust for these adverse childhood experiences, and they may actually be a reflection of the brain trying to heal itself from adverse childhood experiences. So there are lots of other adult diseases. We'll look at a couple of them. Heart disease. Again, adjusting out all the other risk factors, adverse childhood experiences, particularly if you had more than 4, increase your risk of heart disease. Obesity doubles the risk if you have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And just serious social problems. We've talked about social emotional development, the hardwiring of the brain that happens in that birth to 5 population. And so adverse childhood experiences impact that. And what they found is those adverse childhood experiences affect just your day-to-day functioning. So this is the ACE scores and the risk of domestic violence. And we've always known that this has been cyclic. But for a woman who has 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, her risk of being a victim of domestic violence is increased 500%. And so, again, the intergenerational things that we have talked about we thought were maybe just inherited. Maybe this is still a symptom of the adverse childhood experiences. And look at this. Remember that this was done in the Kaiser Health Plan. People had jobs. People had insurance coverage. People went for regular health care. And when they asked people about how they get along at work, there was a correlation with their adverse childhood experiences. Absenteeism greater than 2 days a month went up for every additional adverse childhood experience. Serious financial problems. For those who had adverse childhood experiences, the more adverse childhood experiences you had, the more likely you were to have financial problems. And serious job problems, just getting along with people at work, that social emotional function. If you had more adverse childhood experiences, you had more trouble getting along with people at work. They've also looked at a subset of this and linked it to death certificates. And people who had 6 or more adverse childhood experiences died 20 years earlier than those who didn't. And Dr. Folletti says, we call this in public health the population attributable fraction. He said of depression, at least half of that is probably from adverse childhood experiences. And of the suicide attempts, it's up close to 60%. 65% of alcoholism, 78% of IV drug use can be linked back to adverse childhood experiences. So Dr. Folletti says that adverse childhood experiences are actually the most basic and long-lasting cause of health risk behaviors, of mental illness, social malfunction, disease, disability, and death. And so remember that adverse childhood experiences at the bottom of that pyramid. The next step is that it disrupts brain development at a very sensitive time, birth to 5 while the brain is developing. And that's what leads to the social emotional dysfunction and the other dysfunctions. It is a long-lasting effect from adverse childhood experiences during that sensitive period of brain development. So science tells us that this gets built into our bodies, literally built into our bodies. They talk about it getting under your skin. And we now know a lot more about the science of this stress from adverse childhood experiences and what that does to our bodies. So just to talk a little bit about how it's built into our bodies, if you take a brain cell, a neuron, every cell has DNA in your genes. And we used to think, again, whatever genes you got, that's what you got to work with. Well, now we know that actually the gene expression, what the gene tells the cell to do, can be changed by the environment. And so we think these adverse childhood experiences actually alter the expression of your genes, either by these regulatory proteins or by adding a chemical group called a methyl group that can turn genes off or turn genes on. So this is not just something that's happened superficially. This is really down to your DNA level and the gene level. So I have to tell you this story about epigenetics and how gene expression really works, just because I think it's fascinating. So this is from Randy Jirtle's lab at Duke University. And he studies a strain of mice that he knows their genetic complement. And these two mice, I know they look big on the picture, but these 2 mice have the same genes. They have the same set of genes. And what happens, the normal in this lab series of mice is the one on the left. This one who's yellow and fat and actually is more at risk for diabetes and cancer, and that's why they study this mice genes. And so they took a set of these moms that were pregnant of this specific genetic strain, and they split them up, and half of them they fed a normal diet, and half of them they fed a diet high in methyl groups. That happens to be folic acid for those of you who are into preconception care. So when they had their pups, the people on a normal diet ended up with babies who were yellow and fat and predisposed to cancer and diabetes. But the ones where the mom was fed a diet high in methyl groups, same genetic complement, they came out like the one on the left here. And they were slender, they had brown fur, and they were not predisposed to diabetes or cancer, just by changing the mom's diet during pregnancy. So what does that mean for the nutrition that we think of for our pregnant moms? This hasn't been replicated, obviously, in humans yet, but isn't it a fascinating concept to think that just the mom's diet in pregnancy can turn a gene off or on and result in this kind of change? So there's a whole new world out there for what we understand about what goes on in our environment and what the choices are. So let's talk a little bit about how those genes are changed and the stress, the physiology of how the stress gets under our skin. It's a big topic now with the American Academy of Pediatrics, and these are two of the major articles that came out last year about toxic stress. So the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Harvard Center for the Developing Child are collaborating on this. And they say there are 3 levels of stress. There's positive stress, there is tolerable stress, and there is toxic stress. So what happens is positive stress. Now, there is no such thing as a stress-free life, just so you know. A lot of us think we want that, but actually that wouldn't work. Stress is good in that it teaches us things. And so positive stress means it's a necessary aspect of healthy development, and we learn from it. And that's the one we see most often in children. You have a 15-month-old who can't express what they want, very frustrating, stressful, but that's how they learn. You have a 2-year-old who stumbles. You have a 4-year-old who falls off a bike. You know, with encouragement, you go out there and you encourage them, and they get back up and they go again. And so one of the things that helps us get through all kinds of stress is having a social emotional support. Somebody there with us who will help us, reassure us, and give us assistance and get us back on track. Now, tolerable stress is a little bit more serious stress, okay? Tolerable stress is enough, could be enough, to actually cause changes in our brain. But because we have supportive relationships about us, generally not. But think how hard it is when you have the loss of a loved one, especially for a child, sometimes losing your job, moving to a totally new town. All those things are really significant stresses. You get a family member diagnosed with cancer. That's tolerable stress, mostly because you have people around you who will help you get through those times. What happens with toxic stress is the hallmark of toxic stress is, one, it's severe. Usually it's intense and repetitive, but you don't have enough people around you to buffer that stress. And if we don't have enough around us as adults, you can imagine what it's like for kids who feel very alone anyway. But the really key to toxic stress is that there are not people around who will help you buffer that stress, and it is severe, and it is intense, and it is usually either repeated or prolonged. So the part of the brain that is affected most is the amygdala, which we see there's the gas pedal, and the brake is the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is normally the site in our brain where we have memory and learning. So the hippocampus is where we learn. The amygdala is just the opposite. The amygdala is that immediate reaction, fear, flight, or fright. It starts in the amygdala. And so stress, we have a normal stress response in our bodies. And we're supposed to see a stress. Those brain areas kick in. The amygdala says, let's put out stress hormones. The hippocampus steps back, and we get all these stress hormones flooding our system. They make us breathe faster, our heart beats faster, the blood goes to our legs, we run. Now the problem is, after the stress goes away, you're supposed to shut off. And that's, again, built into our systems. It's called self-regulation. And normally, when the stress goes away, we go back to baseline, so it doesn't damage our bodies. The problem is, in toxic stress, we never get back to baseline. And so those stress hormones continue to circulate, continue to beat our bodies. and we never get back to baseline. So here's how it looks in a graph. So you have these stresses, and they can be very intense, but short-lived. And if you've got people around you to buffer the stress, you generally go back to baseline. But this is more commonly what happens with our kids with adverse childhood experiences. You have this fearful event that goes up, and before you can get back to baseline, you have another one, and another one, and another one, and look how the baseline rises. And you always have this high level of circulating stress hormones. So think of a child who's in a family where there may be an alcoholic or domestic violence, and they hide in their closet when they hear their parents yelling, or they're worried that they're going to get hit. And maybe that happens on Monday night, and maybe it happens on Thursday night, and maybe it happens on Saturday night, and they don't know when it's going to happen again. And so you have this chronically rising level of stress hormones that stay up in that kid, and that's what causes the damage to the brain and the body. So we know, we actually can measure now, that in kids who are abused, in kids who have PTSD, their brains get smaller, their amygdala, the gas pedal, physically gets measurably bigger. And their hippocampus, which is the site of memory and learning, gets smaller. And so they're in this constant state of override, and they're immediately reactive. They fly off the handle at anything because they've got all these circulating hormones, stress hormones. And it can cause permanent damage. So we can measure this in lots of ways. I'm going to show you some examples here. When mothers are stressed, those stress hormones cross the placenta. And we can actually measure the release of the corticotropin-releasing hormone, which is the first thing that crosses to signal the body to put out more stress hormones. And so this was a study from several years ago in California. They took moms who were stressed, and they looked at them, drew their levels, and when they delivered, the ones that were premature had higher stress levels that you could measure by 20 weeks, by the middle of their pregnancy. So we know what happens in pregnancy. This is levels of stress hormones in abused kids. The red line are the levels in abused kids. The blue line is in normal kids. Constantly circulating stress hormone levels. And here's kids in poverty. Poor white kids at age 9. Cortisol, epinephrine, and norepinephrine are the stress hormones. And look at the difference in the baseline levels between kids who have to live in poverty and kids who are middle-class kids and don't have to worry where their next meal is coming from. So we can actually measure these elevated, continuously elevated hormones. And it damages the brain. So you can see here there's a big difference between the normal brain and the brain under toxic stress. And those are from the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. So here's what's interesting. The brain centers for anxiety and fear are the same centers for memory and learning. And so when the anxiety and fear and toxic stress take over, you don't remember things and you can't learn. Does that make sense? They call it the amygdala hijack. And it's actually the same centers as social emotional function. So when you're constantly stressed, you don't get along well with people either. So let's go back to this balance of risk factors and protective factors from the life course perspective. We know that there are a lot of things happening in the environment for our kids that are cumulative, that happen over time, and that we now know impact their outcomes long term. And so if we balance this risk factors and protective factors, on the risk factor side, again, it's all across the child's environment. If we weigh really heavily on the risk factor side, these kids get vulnerable, and they may end up with child abuse. If you look at the other side of the equation, and we can balance real heavily on the protective factor side, we get what we call resilience, right, and school readiness. And so let's look at the things we've talked about. So here's attachment, that hardwiring of the brain that happens birth to 2. If they don't get attachment, look at the risk factor side. They have poor coping skills. They may have failure to thrive. They can't form relationships. They don't trust people. They get aggressive. They get violent. They get antisocial behavior. And on the protective factor side, if they build strong social emotional pathways, they are able to have trusting relationships that allows them to explore their environment, which we call in the school readiness definition approaches to learning, right? Let's look at it from the fact of toxic stress. Again, if we weigh heavily on the risk factor side, where we have the amygdala is putting on the gas pedal, kids can't think because their hippocampus is not working. The amygdala is overriding the hippocampus for that period of stress. They can't concentrate, they can't follow directions, they can't sit still. They're constantly on edge and they're easily provoked. And what do they call that in the classroom? ADHD. And in fact, the AAP has just made that association. They said there are more kids with ADHD who actually had trauma too. Imagine that. So there's a good chance, you know, we've had this kind of epidemic of all these kids getting put on drugs for ADHD. Maybe we should go back and work on the trauma piece and find out about their adverse childhood experiences before we think about putting them on drugs. So same thing with the ACEs. If you weigh heavily on 4 or more ACEs, then you're a lot likely to have worse outcomes than if you have protective factors, which will put you on the positive side. So the AAP says to remember that toxic stress is from strong, frequent, or prolonged activation of the body's stress hormone systems, and they can be buffered by an adult relationship, but usually in toxic stress they are not. They cause permanent changes in the brain, even though the child may not look like any different on the outside. You've got to be thinking about this because they won't show it on the outside except in their behavior. And it's the amygdala and the hippocampus that we're worried about, and we actually see changes in. So the good news here is that a caring and responsive adult can make a difference in a child's life and make a long-lasting impact on a child's outcome. So we can actually measure that as well. So these are the stress hormones measured in a child with a parent who gets stressed, and they measured the hormones. And if there's a secure attachment between that parent and child, there's very little change in the child's stress hormones. But if they're with a parent and there's not that secure attachment, then we see this flood of stress hormones that come out in the child. And even if the caregiver is not a parent and the child is stressed, if the caregiver is responsive, then there's very little change in the stress hormones in the child. But if the caregiver is not responsive, then you again see this flood of stress hormones that come out. So the good news here is that there are things we can do. Again, we're trying to, we may not be able to get rid of the risk factors, but we can push up the protective factors and have these kids do better. So here's an example. This is Washington State actually surveys for adverse childhood experiences in their schools. And what they found out, this is a composite of a typical classroom of 30 kids, which we hope is typical. They had about 6 students with no ACEs and about 5 students with 1 ACE. So about a third of their class, which is very consistent with the numbers we looked at earlier, has very low or no ACEs, okay? On the other hand, if you take the 4, 5, and 6 ACEs, about 13 of every 30 students, that's almost half the class, who have had significant numbers of adverse childhood experiences. And so when they see kids who have trouble sitting still in class and can't concentrate and can't learn, they don't try to punish them. They've developed a program called Compassionate Schools. And in their Compassionate Schools program, they recognize what toxic stress is all about, and they're trying to heal the toxic stress. And so the teachers don't punish kids for bad behavior. They know that that represents the fact a child has gone through trauma, and they work on trying to address the trauma. These kids with toxic stress live much of their lives in fight, flight, or fright mode. And so they respond to the world as a place of constant danger because for them it is in the way they've grown up. And again, if they have these high-risk behaviors that teenagers have, in Washington State they don't consider those as bad choices by teens. What they say is they are the coping mechanisms these kids are using to try to address these adverse childhood experiences they've been through. So again, from the AAP, this science and what we know now about toxic stress should change the way we approach kids. It should change what we do. And if we're worried about adult disease, as I tell my partners in public health all the time, the place to start is about treating adverse childhood experiences and preventing them if we can, because that's really the largest contributor to many of the adult diseases that we work on regularly. So again, the kids may not look different on the outside, but inside we need to recognize that these things are going on. And this is what lays the foundation for their learning and their success in life. So what are the kinds of things we can do? So this is from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. One thing we can do is build positive relationships with these kids. We can have safe communities and families. It's extremely stressful if you have to walk out of your house and hear gunshots. You know, it's just another manifestation of toxic stress. We can try to recognize toxic stress and adverse childhood experiences and deal with them. And children should all have their medical home where they get screened for developmental care, for their nutrition, and for the other things that will make their life better. So one more round on the life course perspective, and that is that the critical period of development for the brain is birth to 5. And these overlays represent what part of their environment has the most influence over kids during different age groups. And you'll notice there, for birth to 5, it's still mostly family. There's a small segment of childcare, and there's some in the community, church groups, things like that. But by and large, the most major influences on a child's environment relate to their family. So as we strengthen families, we will strengthen kids. Again, from the video, remember this, almost 250,000 children live in poverty. We only have 1 million kids, so that's 1 in 4 of Kentucky's kids, at least, live in poverty. We have high rates of non-parental care. Again, we have 200,000 with social, emotional, developmental, or behavioral disorders, and 50% of our kids are not ready for kindergarten. So even though health is improving, we don't have as many hospitalizations, kids don't have as many sick days at school, that they can be in school longer. But on the other hand, we're seeing more diabetes in young children. We're seeing more ADHD that's treated with meds. We're seeing more asthma. We're seeing more obesity. We're seeing more autism. So are our kids really getting healthier? So you saw in the video, we want every child to have a chance. And what they say, even at the national level, you can't get a fair chance if you don't have a fair start in life. And that's from Dr. Michael Liu, who's head of our Maternal Child Health Bureau in Washington. And the problem is many of our kids don't get a fair chance from very, very early on, and that's why we have the opportunity to intervene. So Dr. James Heckman says, whether or not you succeed in life should not depend on the accident of birth. And what he's saying is it shouldn't matter what kind of family you're born into, you should have an equal chance at a shot in success. And so much of what happens in the United States today is that kids born into different families don't have an equal shot. So those disparities start early. So our goal is to turn our attention and say every child and every family is going to go through stress. And we want them to have the support they need. And in fact, there are many times that we can predict when they're going to have stressful situations. I can tell you, taking a new baby home is stressful for anybody. And we don't do enough to prepare families for that. We don't do enough to prepare families. So whatever supports families need, they ought to be able to get them, hopefully in their communities, and they shouldn't be embarrassed about asking. I had a lot of parents who wouldn't ask me questions about a child's development because they didn't want to sound stupid. But kids don't come with an instruction manual. And so we've got to find a way to encourage the norm to be to ask questions about what can I do? What should I do with this? So again, Dr. Shunkoff from the Harvard Center for the Developing Child is suggesting 3 ways that with all this new science, we start to apply it. One is about building caring relationships with young children. And you all have the opportunity to do that on a regular basis. The second is to support parents by improving their skills. And again, parents, for instance, who live in poverty, it's not that they can't accomplish things, it's just they have so much else to deal with. The skills for living in poverty are very different than the skills for living in the middle class. And part of that is just learning new skills. So, building caring relationships. This is a very vulnerable time for kids, birth to 5. Their brain is being developed. They need somebody they can count on, and you can be that somebody. You remember the person who said something encouraging to you years and years and years ago. So you have the opportunity to make that kind of difference, and it's not just a feel-good difference. There is a long-lasting difference you can do to help build their social-emotional development. Support parents by improving their skills. We have lots of opportunity to improve skills. In fact, Dr. Shunkoff and Dr. Heckman both say the most effective programs that we can do for early childhood are to build skills in our parents. So strengthening the skills of parents, and not only does that help with how they relate to their child, but it helps them in their education and getting jobs, things Mr. Sawaki talked about. We see that in our HANDS program regularly. You know, we work on family self-sufficiency as much as we work on child development, because as the families learn how to get along with the circumstances they're in, then they thrive and then their children thrive. So here's some of Dr. Heckman's work, and just Dr. Heckman was one of the first ones who said that these social-emotional skills are important. And he did it by looking at the outcomes of people who had GEDs, people who had been through different things, and it turns out the social-emotional skills, by his studies of economics, showed that the social-emotional skills were the biggest predictor of success in life. And now he has more recent things out that say, not only do the social-emotional skills predict success in life, they improve a person's health. And they improve then cognitive skills later on. So here's an example of how we build skills in parents. So this is in the court system in Minnesota. And they had a child support court, and instead of just coming and saying, yes, the paternity tests show you're a father, you pay X amount and send him out the door, this judge decided that they would do more than that. And so when he has parents come to child support court, both parents have to come, and he assigns them to parenting classes. And they have to attend together even though they're split, and only one of them is going to be having the full custody of the child. So they have to go to a class for 8 to 10 weeks, and they have to talk about things like, so when is the bedtime? And we're all going to give them the same bedtime. What sports are they going to play? They work through that to develop a 24-page document that the judge then signs, and that's part of his court order. So it's building skills in the parents. How do you get along? How do you relate consistently to your child? Now, they haven't been doing this long enough to have long-term outcomes, but they have a lot of improvements in the participation of the fathers and in the child support being paid, and the kids are doing better. So the third way to make a difference is to support professionals by improving skills, and that's why you're here. So in our Kentucky Early Childhood business model, we've always talked about supporting families and building the professional competence to do that. So one of the things we do is we now want to not just have families understand. It's not just a matter of giving them out information. You want to build their skills. So you have to have skills to do that. And so what we're working on is a program called Strengthening Families. This is a national program from the Center for the Study of Social Policy. And it's about a framework through which we can all deal better with families by reinforcing those protective factors we've talked about. It's for all families because every parent needs to feel supported. Every parent is going to go through times of stress. It builds on family strengths, and it's not really a new program. It's really just a framework that can help us guide our decisions and do the small things that will help build protective factors. For those of you who look at national websites, you'll probably see yours up here. This is all kinds of national partners involved in this, and 37, I think, other states. But the idea is to build these protective factors, and if we can build protective factors and make those supports available for all families in their communities, then we will have better outcomes for our kids, we'll have more school readiness, and we'll have less child abuse. And the idea is that no matter where a family goes in the community for services, that somebody there is going to know about protective factors and help them identify their strengths and build on those protective factors. So these are the protective factors we're working with. They're the ones that are nationally studied through research. Parental resilience. Families are strong and can cope in good times and bad. Social connections. Families need people they can count on. Knowledge of child development. You know, one of the biggest triggers for child maltreatment is unrealistic expectations of what the child should be doing. So knowledge of child development is extremely important. Concrete supports in time of need, so that people can know where their next meal is coming from. They can have a roof over their head. They can pay their bills. That's a big help in creating a healthy environment for a child. Social emotional competence of children. You know, children learn from their parents, and if their parents can't model how to calm down instead of throwing an anger fit, you know, we need to teach the parents those kinds of skills so that we can also build those skills in their children. And nurturing and attachment, we talked at the beginning about how important, how critical that attachment piece is. So what we're shifting to for our thought is, instead of focusing on at-risk families, this is for all families. We want to build these strengths in all families. Instead of focusing on risk factors, we're going to work on building protective factors. Instead of being deficit-based, we're going to look at the strengths these families have because they do have them. We just tend to overlook them as we look at the deficits. And instead of talking about how inadequate the family is, the family has to deal with what the family has to deal with, and we have to work on skills that will help them deal with that. And instead of just trying to prevent things, we are trying to promote strong families and healthy development. So here's another example. This Fostering Hope is a organization in Oregon who works with setting up foster families. And they began to study toxic stress and realized how important it was for their families. And they ran across strengthening families, and they decided they would build that in to what they do every day. Now, they got a lot of pushback from their staff who said, these parents just don't care. They're just terrible parents. And they had to change their thinking to say, these people would want to do well, and they don't have the skills, and we've got to help them care for their kids. And so they went through the protective factors, and they built that into the way they interact with their families. And 3 years later, they had a 30% reduction in the number of foster care needed in one county. So that's the kind of thing that we're working towards. So we are recognizing anew the importance of families. We're trying to get rid of the stigma of asking for help, because we all need help. We need to be in partnership between what our agencies do and what our families do, and everyone has a role to play. And what the science that we've looked at tells you is that it's important, you'll have a long-lasting impact, and you do make a difference. So here's our vision. All Kentucky's children will be healthy, safe, and prepared to succeed in school and in life through families that are supported and strengthened in their own communities. And working together, we want to provide the tools and support so that families will be strong, connected, supported, loving, understanding, and knowledgeable. So that way Kentucky families will thrive and their children will thrive. So let me leave you with a few words from other people. Mike, if you want to cue up the other video, we'll talk about the protective factors and how important that is for us to embed.
We need to learn again how to look for the strengths of our families. If we can do that, if the families understand that someone sees the good, understands some of the struggles that they may be going through, and still sees them as an equal partner, then we can create the kind of relationship that makes so much possible.
All families face stress, just the simple things that, getting your homework done, getting the kids ready for bed, getting supper, all those things that are stressors or difficulties that every family faces. When you look at at-risk families, there's additional things. Poverty is found in about 75% of substantiated cases in Kentucky. Substance abuse is found in about 60% of all substantiated cases. So if you take the normal family stress and you add those additional things, those are the type of things that our families are facing. We know that families typically who have gotten into situations of abuse and neglect, 75% of those families will have more than one of those additional stress factors.
Providers can oftentimes tell a family about certain resources out in the community, but when you hear it from other parents and you say, this is the therapist that really is good at working with kids that have this disability, or this is the program that really did listen to my voice as a parent, getting those resources from each other, reducing that isolation, and just being able to know that you're in a community where people understand your kids' quirky behaviors or challenging behaviors, and they're not judging you.
We know that all families need support from their communities to succeed and to help families and children thrive. We know from working with families that have had issues or at risk of abuse or neglect that they are particularly in need of support. We try to help them find resources in their community, concrete resources, families that have access to things like rent assistance, affordable child care, food, when they're confronted with poverty or those kind of stresses, are much less likely to fall into that cycle of abuse or neglect if they've access to those services.
There's no way to explain the isolation a family feels when they're sitting at home in their community by themselves and their child doesn't have friends, or their child has difficulty making friends or keeping friends. It's just so isolating.
In my community in Taylorsville, I started a support group several years ago, 5 years ago, and for other parents who had children with disabilities and some who do not. And coming together with them helped me, for I could have someone, because I would get down and I needed someone to talk to. And it helped me to bond with them and as an outlet. And together, you know, we would all, you know, depend on each other and help each other. When my son, the crisis started happening with my son, I had no one. I called organization after organization. They couldn't help me. I was prejudged, and that's what cut to my core. There's no excuse for someone, if they want help, that they can't get help.
It always helps to have somebody to talk to about things in life, because it's not fun being alone, because I started out alone and I had to just research everything on the computer till my eyes fell out, basically, because I didn't have anybody. I didn't know about the organizations that you could call. And I actually started a couple of support groups in my region. I try to help them, and they might know some things that I haven't learned yet, and they can teach me.
We know that the provision of safe and stable, nurturing relationships is key to helping children overcome adversity, and that we all have a role in that. Research tells us that children succeed at greater rates when they have more than one source of this type of long-term support and to help them through trauma.
What is it we would wish every child would be saying to themselves? Things like, I'm wonderful. Things like, I can do it. Things like, I can work hard. Things like, I can be kind. And then we look up the research and we say, hey, any research around this stuff? And sure enough, we find that if children receive these kinds of messages, they're much more likely to internalize that as part of their self-talk.
I think the key to that is helping families develop strong, nurturing and relationships with children, and that whole bonding issue. We know that's particularly important for young children, but it's something that goes through the life cycle of the child. I think it's not appropriate to assume that families have that skill, that they're just simply born with that skill. You have to teach some families how to do that and how to interact with children and how to build those relationships. When we look at situations where abuse or neglect has occurred, a common theme we see is unrealistic expectations. As an example, you might see a situation where a parent has shaken a baby, and when you start talking with them about what has happened, you realize that the precipitator to shaking is often crying. Well, those of us who have experience in child development know that crying is predictable, that it is something that all babies do, but if a parent doesn't have that information, that knowledge, that normal expectation, then they're going to become frustrated and become concerned about what's going on with the child. As a parent, if we expect that behavior, then it's easier for us to not only respond to it calmly, but know how to help that child through that developmental change.
As parents, it's very personal when we go in to advocate for our child, but sometimes when you go in with guns blazing, that's not the most effective way to build partnerships and get what your kids need. And so we really talk about how do you partner, how do you become an effective team member with those other people on your child's team, and how do you talk in a way, in a strategic way, so that those folks can really hear what you need for your child and why you need it for your child.
And that's what the protective factors is kind of founded in. It's looking at family strengths, helping families identify their strengths, looking to the families to find the solutions. It's important that our interventions with families are driven by the family, that the family's in control of that. They're their own best expert. So we take those strengths and then we try to build on those in a way that helps the family get through the stress and build their level of confidence, their resiliency, their ability to deal with stress.
We need to partner with the people who have the other part of the day, the part of the day that we don't have. We need to go back and we need to say to them again, partner with us. Together, we can do something that neither one of us can do alone. It's destiny. We're part of that parenting, and we need to partner again in a far more effective way, in a far more intentional way, in a far more systematic way than we've ever done before. It's no longer good enough to have the parent like us and we like the parent. What else can we do so that parents help us be more effective and we help families be more effective?
I think one of the biggest challenges we face as providers, and one of the changes we can make, is to come to the realization that the vast majority of parents love their children and they want what's best for their children. Our role is to help us get them there.
If we can have the house lights up, please. So Courtney, are you in the back? I want to recognize Courtney, who put together these videos for us, and her team. Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left. If there are any questions, we have microphones in the audience, or if you just want to meet me down here, we can do questions then. Any burning issues? I need the house lights up and these down, please. Yeah, here's a question. Yes, we'll make our slides available, and I think they actually have videoed this session, so you should be able to get it. So I hope you've gained some understanding of what goes on with our kids and some tools or at least some things to think about and how we might be more effective in doing that. But thank you for being here, and thanks for all you do, and we'll close the session now.
That concludes our session. Please join us for refreshments in the exhibit area before going to your next session.